And what occurred to me was that for the first time in a long time, maybe forever, there was this monstrously huge constituency had just been created overnight, the 48%. And nobody knew they were one of the 48%, or indeed the 52% the day before.
Hello and welcome to Confessions. I'm Giles Fraser. This is the podcast where I'm joined by an interesting and well-known guest to find out where their underlying values come from, to find out what it is that makes them tick. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Matt Kelly, who's the editor of the New European and so much else besides. Great to have you here, mate.
Thank you. Honestly, I'm thrilled to be here.
The elephant in the room is you and I are going to disagree vehemently about...
Let's not talk about...
Should we not do it at all?
Don't talk about the B word. Let's see how far we get out without mentioning the B word.
Let's see how far we get before we get to Brexit. Matt was very kind. I'll say this up front. And we've never met before, but when I finished at The Guardian, you phoned me up and said, come and write for the New European for a bit. And I was like terrified doing that.
Well, you mulled it over and I thought, maybe there's a chance. And then you broke the bad news to me.
Yeah, well, I just didn't want to be Mr. Hate figure,
no,
you know.
I get it. You're forgiven.
So how we start with this, Matt, is we talk about, it's about you and about your values and about where they come from and all of that sort of stuff. So perhaps you describe for us just a bit, you know, where you come from, family, background, all that sort of stuff.
So I come from Liverpool, and my mum and dad were both journalists, both still alive. My dad's 84 now, I think. My mum's 77 or something like that, but both in nice, robust health. And I guess I grew up a fairly sort of standard middle-class Merseyside life. I was growing up in the 70s, which obviously was like a really bad time for Liverpool, but of course when you're in it you don't really...
How old are you? I'm
49 now. Right. So I was born in 1969.
Right.
And I was pretty aimless at school. I was clever, I knew that, so I got into a good school, but then I had real trouble concentrating and I was not what I would call academic at school.
Were you a bit of a lad?
No, do you know what? I wasn't really. Okay. I was a bit kind of... I guess I was a bit sort of shy and wasn't. People now will say how gregarious I am, which is really nice. But I was painfully shy as a kid. Right? You know, I mean, I would hate going into a room for full of people I didn't know. You know, I mean, right. acutely shy about that. But my dad and my mum were both kind of very open, social people. So we had loads of people coming in and out of the house. We had great friendships with people like Anthony Bevins, who older people will remember as a great political journalist, total kind of rebel. And because my dad was a sports editor on the Football Echo at one point, so we had loads of football people coming in and out, including Kevin Keegan and Tommy Smith and all of these.
And you're a Liverpool fan.
And I'm a Liverpool fan. So in a way, it kind of... I mean, of course, your childhood always feels normal, but looking back, it was a really great childhood. You know, it's Kevin Keegan babysat for me once. You know? So if anyone's ever asked enough to get me to write an autobiography, it's going to be called Kevin Keegan Was My Babysitter. But yeah, he called in one afternoon on the way home just to say hello to my mum and dad, and because we were sick, I was sick, and so my mum and dad said, "Can we just nip out to where we were meant to be going for dinner, just to pop in? Can you look after the kids?"
And he was, and that was the time when he was.
Oh no, so he was. I mean, he was at the peak of his career, and I've got this very vivid memory of Kevin sitting with all the hair, sitting on a bar stool in our kitchen while me and Danny, my brother, played on the lino at his feet while he read the paper.
Outstanding.
So
you can only be a Liverpool fan.
I am a Liverpool fan.
Do you go?
I used to go when I was up in Merseyside, but I haven't been so much. And I fell out of love with football a little bit about 4 or 5 years ago. I just thought, I mean, it was coinciding with some poor performances from Liverpool, so maybe it's just fickleness. But and I used to have season tickets at Arsenal because I live very near the Arsenal stadium, and my kids are Arsenal fans. So I used to take them, but then they had a couple of lousy seasons. So in truth, I haven't been to a football match for a couple of years, but I must say I'm thoroughly enjoying the Klopp revolution.
Yeah. You're doing well.
Yeah.
Damn you.
Yes. Yeah. Are you an Evertonian?
No. I'm a big Chelsea fan.
Oh, are you? Okay.
Yeah, no, right, overweight, bald. You know, I mean, it's just I fit the.
Yeah.
Now listen, and so your parents, were they lefties? Was that there?
Very much. So my grandfather on my dad's side was a socialist mayor of Bootle during World War II. And in fact, he had the nickname the Tin Hat Mayor because it was during the Bootle was really badly blitzed, and And Joseph Sylvester Kelly would go out and dig people out in his Mac and his tin hat. And the Brutal Times wrote this wonderful tribute to him as a leader column when he retired. Hats off to the mayor, you know. And he was basically saying, you know, there've been more wealthy men of greater lineage and standing, but none will stand comparison with Joseph Sylvester Kelly. You know?
Wow.
Yeah, and so I still look at that and I kind of feel, wow, you know, that's what it means to be.
Was there did your family come from Ireland at some point?
Yeah, so I think it's, funnily enough, I was just looking at the genealogy. One of my uncles went quite far back into the early 1800s, and yeah, they were all from County Cork, I think, and Clare, and they came over 5 or 6 generations ago. And yeah, so it's got that kind of Irish Celtic lineage. Yeah.
My great uncle Sam, I'm writing a book about it at the moment. My great uncle Sam was at the synagogue in Princess Road in Toxteth for 40 years. It was like he was the
amazing.
That was my background, so I have that connection with.
Yeah. Well, I remember, of course, the riots in Toxteth. You know, it's hard to look back and remember what Toxteth was like because you go there now and it's really, you know, a prime piece of Liverpool's real estate, because they've got these wonderful houses which were all owned by shipbuilders, and the streets are all named after shipbuilders and great magazines, you know, Huskisson Street.
Slavery, wasn't it? I mean,
it was all built on wealth accumulated through slavery, of course, you know, which is the truth about the northwest of England's great kind of industrial birth, was that it was pioneered on the back of cotton coming back from the States. And there was this triangle of shipping going from Liverpool to Africa, where they would pick up the slaves, drop the slaves off in America, pick the cotton up, drop the cotton off in Liverpool. And so it's the slave triangle, I think it was called. So, I mean, there's always been sort of myths of slaves being chained up in Liverpool and stuff like this, which was never true because slaves would never come on that leg of the journey. But if you go to Liverpool's Maritime Museum, there are these most astonishing maps, flat plans of the boats showing how they would cram in the slaves, you know, and it is like, I mean, sardines have got it good, you know. I mean, they are literally like this, you know, and of course they look like corpses laid out on the deck of a ship, which is, in some regards, you know, what they were, you know.
I'm in ecclesiastical terms, I'm a canon, and my canonry is from Ghana. So I go to Ghana a little bit, and if you go to the Gold Coast in Ghana, there's this horrendous, they call it a fort, I guess, where the slaves were underneath, and the conditions under which, and I mean, they're so disgusting and so horrendous. But what for me is like doubly horrendous is on top of this prison underneath, there was a place where they used to have church services.
Amazing.
So as these people were underneath,
Amazing.
they could hear them singing hymns and so forth like that.
Amazing.
And you can think, how do these people not understand the connection between?
Well, I've got a mate in Liverpool called John Sinclair, and years ago, John came back from a holiday in Barbados, I think it was, and he told me a story that I'll never forget. And it was he said, you know, there were parts of Barbados obviously that are desperately poor, and he said he walked past the church and he could hear the preacher talking to the black congregation, a black preacher, and it was effectively saying, if God didn't want this to be your life,
don't tell me that.
If God didn't want this for you, God wouldn't have it for you. And I just thought the culpability of sometimes of the way religion affirms people's trajectory in life is frightening.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. You didn't have any. There was no religion in your background.
Yeah, no, my dad's. I'm Roman Catholic. My mum was Church of England, but in those days, for you to be baptised into the Roman Catholic Church, you had to agree to be a Roman Catholic. So my mum sort of seeded that, and so yeah, we were brought up Roman Catholic, and I would still describe myself as a Roman Catholic, although of late I've struggled with it a little bit in terms of the institution of the church, but not the idea of the church itself at all, which I think is a wholly good thing.
Right.
You know, even if it's not true, I think it's a wholly good thing. Yeah. But the institution of the Roman Catholic Church itself is starting to bother me. Yeah.
You come to that a bit late.
After 49 years, I've finally worked it out.
Well, I was going to say the Reformation is the first Brexit, but I'm not even going to come to that. Yeah. Let's just wait for a minute before we argue about that. So. When you left school, and what did you do when you left school?
I worked to work on the fairground, Southport Fair, and I stood there calling people onto the waltzers and various rides and making candy floss and stuff. And I left school with one. I had to leave the good school I was in to go because my A-level First year was so appalling that they basically said, look, he's not going to get anywhere here. But I went to a technical college in Bootle called Hugh Baird Technical College and had 2 really good years there, but left with 1 E in English at A level, and failed geography and failed whatever else it was, sociology, whatever. And I only got the E because there was a language component, and I plagiarised a short story by Hilaire Belloc, right, completely. And it was a fabulous story about the devil taking somebody over the streets of Paris, showing them their real lives, and it was extraordinary. But there's a bit of a clue there, I think, about what I feel was obvious now looking back, that I was reading short stories by Hilaire Belloc and was able to plagiarise them sufficiently well to get an A level out of it. And yet, academically, I was absolutely hopeless. But my absolute belief is that I've suffered from ADHD all my life, and I just can't. I've never had the capacity for concentration and also I have a great capacity for impulsivity, which turns out to be 2 short spans of attention, and impulsivity are great attributes in some forms of journalism.
Yes. And bad in other forms of life. I think I have a bit of that as well.
So since then, I've always had a feeling that that I wasn't good enough to go to university, but I'm certainly sure that I am smart enough to go to university. But that was definitely a factor in feeling a little bit chippy, I think. For a while.
Chippy drives you on, doesn't it?
Yeah, totally.
Chippy is like a motor.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
And so that motor took you into out of the fairground.
Yeah. So out of the fairground, and my mum fixed me up with a week's work experience on the Bootle Times, which was a really good little weekly newspaper that my dad had worked for when he was a kid, And I took to it like the proverbial duck to water. Really loved it. Loved being able to go out and getting stories and meeting people, and just the endless variety.
So the shyness is going here if you're going to go out and meet people.
Yes. So as long as I don't have to expect any sort of real social interaction, as long as the
so if you're going to a party where it's just drinks and canapes, it's like you hate that.
Painful. I mean, even today I find it an effort, but I'm much better at it now. But when I was a kid, it was a real anxiety.
But if you've got a job to do,
no problem at all. And also, you're in a slight remove as a journalist. So you're in a little bubble you're a thing. You're not just 2 people talking. You're a thing, and someone is being interviewed and stuff like that. So it's a slightly different context. And I really loved that job. And I went on to work on a paper called the Formby Times. All of these papers sadly shut now, because of no demand for paid for local papers. And I did what's called my indentures at the Formby Times, which was effectively a training programme that had an official result at the end. And at the end of that, I passed with flying colours and got a job as a district reporter on the Daily Post, which was the biggest morning newspaper in Liverpool. And I was such a hopeless district reporter. It was in the days of pagers, right? And this was the only way that the news desk could get in touch with you, was via your pager. And I used to just throw the pager away, drop it in a bin or something like that, and pretend I'd lost it so that I wouldn't have to be at the end of this brutal news desk, which I'd now look back and they were, of course, kittens. But so I was called in. I was called in one day by a really good editor of the Daily Post. He was a very nice man, and he said to me, I really think you should think of another career. You're not a journalist. That's what we've established in the last year. You are not a journalist. And for one last throw of the dice, I thought I'll try and apply to be a sub-editor, which is all about laying out, designing pages, writing headlines, and importantly, it was in the office environment. And I got a job on the sister paper, the Liverpool Echo, and found that I loved the idea of producing and designing newspapers. I just loved the order of it. I loved the creativity you could bring to it. I was good with words, it turned out, so I could write good headlines, and I had a flair for design. So that quickly became my route into what ended up as a long career on the Daily Mirror via the Daily Record.
And your politics at this time, when you were sort of doing that?
Yeah, so I would say it's hard really. I wouldn't say I was ever I was definitely not a badge wearing anything, but I was definitely, there was no chance I was anything other than a Labour voter. That would have been really heretical, to have deviated from that. Except, I think, for the one moment when Shirley Williams came in with the SDP and she ran for the Crosby by-election. Now, I was too young to vote, but there was something about the breakaway nature of the SDP that was quite appealing. But yeah, no, Labour through and through, which is a problem these days because I don't particularly feel comfortable with the direction the Labour Party's going.
But you're badge wearer in chief, though, of the issue of the day.
Yes, I am.
So let's talk about this. So where did the sort of the Europeanism come from, even before the vote, before all of that? So via Ernest Hemingway, right? Really pompously. So we went on holiday. Not a European, but I would argue a great European in his value sense, and certainly what I loved about the idea of Europeanism. And we were on holiday in a place called Tossa de Mar on the Costa Brava, and there was a little bookshop there, and I would have been about 14 or 15, and there was a book by Hemingway called The Dangerous Summer, which was one of the last books he wrote, and it's about bullfighting, so it's not a very politically correct topic these days. But I picked it out, and I've still got it, and I bought this book, and I just devoured the way he wrote. And then I read a biography of Hemingway by a guy called Carlos Baker, which was the biography that kind of established the myth of Hemingway being this incredible internationalist, larger than life, into all these, remarkably outdoorsy stuff, the hunting, the big game fishing, all of this stuff. And of course, Hemingway spent a lot of time in Paris and a lot of time in Spain. And I used to go over on my own to Paris for a week's holiday when I was on the Daily Post. That's what I'd do. Do you have other languages?
No, nothing. No, I mean a little bit of Spanish because I spent a couple of years spending a lot of time in Argentina about 5 or 6 years ago working for a paper there. So I picked up a bit of Spanish, but no, effectively not. And so I'd spend a lot of time in Paris, sitting in the Café du Dôme, reading the International Herald Tribune as it was then, and thinking I'm going to be the next Hemingway, and that kind of. That had a big impact on me.
That's pretty romantic, so outdoorsy plus intellectual type of thing.
So that was what I wanted to be. But I look back now and I think it was, as it possibly was with Hemingway, it was a real contradiction of what I am or what I was, which isn't a big, robust kind of huge show off, I'm not like that, except I've adopted elements of that because of my desire.
So there's
to be
a
like
romanticism about Europe quite early on through Hemingway and things like that.
Especially around the sort of 20s and 30s of Europe, the idea that people were out there creating stuff in little garrets, and being true to their artistic intent. People like, Matisse and Picasso, who was a little bit more established by the time he got to Paris. But certainly the idea that Europe was a place of free-flowing ideas and creativity was very attractive to me. And being able to cross without any boundaries, which is why I felt so pissed off on June the 24th, 2016. I couldn't believe it, and of course...
Did you expect it to go that way?
No, not at all. Not at all. Total complacency. And the other factor as well is Liverpool is a very cosmopolitan, international, outward-looking city. And that confounded me, the fact that the northwest of England had voted to remain largely, but the northeast of England, fairly similar demographics and makeup of people, had voted in very strong numbers to leave Europe, which confused me and still confuses me. And I can only think that it's because Liverpool had seen the benefits of the European Union in a way that they hadn't done in Sunderland, for instance. They had the Capital of Culture programme, and they had, you go around lots of places in Liverpool and you'll see plaques with the European Union on it. So, yeah, I felt absolutely shocked.
That evening when Sunderland sort of like...
Yeah, when it came in.
And that's the point where everybody goes, oh my God, this could go the other way.
Exactly. And it was... And it was shocking. We'll all remember that sort of David Dimbleby moment, where he says, "We are out," and it was kind of wow. And the finality of it is what I felt was so shocking. And I was in Shoreditch at the time. The next morning, beautiful day, but everybody very gloomy. And it reminded me, the last moment I can remember it being that sort of consensus of emotion was when Diana died. It was kind of like everybody, oh, my God, and everybody talking about the same thing. You didn't have to introduce the topic. You could just go up to somebody and say, "Can you believe it?" And they would say, "No, I just can't believe it," And I heard a couple of baristas in this cafe talking about, what do you think it means? Will we be able to stay? I went to buy a shirt.
This is central casting.
Yeah, no, but it's
so,
true.
so in
But
terms of my Lever perspective,
it's
the idea that
absolutely
Matt
true.
Kelly on the morning is
I'll tell you
talking
where it was.
to baristas in Shoreditch.
No. I wasn't talking to them. It was in the All Press Cafe in Redchurch Street in Shoreditch.
Right,
and
I know.
these two, I don't know, Italian or Spanish, they were speaking in English anyway. And they were like, my God, And then, and I'll reaffirm your stereotype of me, I then went to a shirt shop, bought a shirt, and it was an English guy who was saying he had, his wife was from Greece, and their plan was to emigrate to Athens, and they had no idea whether this was going to be possible and all of this. Now, those conversations weren't really material. I just thought, but it just sort of made me think there is a moment. And what occurred to me was that for the first time in a long time, maybe forever, there was this monstrously huge constituency had just been created overnight, the 48%. And nobody knew they were one of the 48%, or indeed the 52% the day before. But suddenly, and the thing about the 48% was that they were all angry and confused, and there was a real emotion there. And when I say all, obviously,
yes,
I'm generalising massively, but they were certainly disappointed.
There's definitely a palpable anger.
Yeah. And because I'm a newspaper man, I thought there's a huge opportunity here because no one's speaking to them.
This on the first
This was on the day after. So I emailed my boss, the chief exec of this company that I work for called Archins. And my day job is chief content officer of about 120 newspapers and magazines. And I emailed him and I said, if ever there was a time for a new newspaper, it's right now, because you've got so many people. They're all bound together by one issue. They're all emotionally charged, and we know where they live because we had the map of where the distribution was. And I'd only been in the job 6 months or so I was kind of expecting him to say, nice idea, and to bat it into the long grass. Because there'd been notably, there'd been one newspaper just closed and cost the company £9 million, for a 10-week experiment. So it wasn't
what
great,
was that?
New Day. Do you remember
that's
the
right. I
Trinity
remember
Mirror,
New
which was
Day.
a really nice paper, but it
That's
didn't.
right,
It just didn't have a market. And
Yes.
and actually, if people ask me what's the difference between the New European and the New Day, apart from the fact that we had no budget and they had massive budgets, I would say that everybody knew whether the New European was meant to be for them, but who knew whether you were a New Day reader or not? So it was that kind of connection. And anyway, I went back into work on this. So that was on the Friday. Went back into the work on the Tuesday for our executive meeting, and I forgot completely about this idea. And we had this very long, depressing meeting about how Brexit was going to be bad for the business. And then at the end of it, my boss said, has anyone got any positive ideas? And stared at me, and I remembered this. I said, oh yeah, why don't we launch a new newspaper? And again, expected it to be laughed out of court, but it wasn't. Everybody got the idea. And we agreed to do it on the basis. The CFO was understandably nervous about committing to a long-term project that could cost us a lot of money. And the biggest stroke of genius is too much, but the biggest bit of cleverness I had in the whole thing was this idea which popped into my head, and I said, we'll call it pop-up publishing. We'll only do it for 4 weeks. And instantly everyone relaxed. So, because how bad could it be over 4 weeks, and we get loads of attention. It would be a great thing for Archant. So we agreed the next day to do it. So this is now 4 days after the vote. And then we had a national newspaper on newsstands nationwide the following Friday.
I don't know how you did it so quickly.
Because newspapers can be done quickly if you know what you're doing, as opposed to websites, which take, ironically, quite a long time to if you want to build a bespoke website, it's quite a, it's a thing, it takes months to do. But to throw out a newspaper, as long as you can design it and you've got the distribution network, it's very, very easy. I'm good at design. I had a great contacts book from all my time at the Mirror, so I was able to call on people like Jonathan Friedland and Peter Bale and Tanit Koch and all of these talents to come and write for the first issue.
And everyone's looking for something to write because they're just like pumped up about it.
And everyone was sort of taken with the sort of madness of somebody launching a newspaper. So that in itself got us loads of marketing, free marketing, so Andrew Neil got us onto the Politics show and radio wanted to talk about this crazy project. And so we launched it. There was a big argument about whether it should be like cheap or expensive, and I was very keen and clear that it should be expensive.
A couple of quid, isn't it?
It's £2.50 now, but it was £2 to start with, and I thought price isn't going to be the defining factor here. If people care, they'll pay. To be honest with you, I wish we'd charged £5 for it now, because I think it would have still carried a big audience. Put it out into the market. It stays on sale all week, a bit like the New Statesman or the Spectator. So I never find out how it's that issue's sold until 2 weeks later. But I remember walking down the embankment and the phone ringing, and it was the circulation guy. I was hoping we might have sold 10,000 copies, and we sold 40,000 copies. No marketing, nothing. So suddenly I was like, wow.
But you knew how to get it on the newsstands.
Yeah,
that was the key thing.
And it was very impactful cover. There was nothing looked quite like it. It was a big massive cartoon, and the first cartoon. I look back now, and I wouldn't run it now because it was incredibly condescending. It had a picture of two people on a sofa and their pet dog in front of them. And the man saying to the woman, I wonder if dogs think. And there's a massive big thought bubble coming out of the dog's head, and the thought bubble saying, these absolute idiots voting to leave a union of such greatness, and all of this, dooming the nation to years of economic consequences, blah, 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 blah. But it was, we literally called leavers idiots on the first day, which, it's a cartoon.
Yes. No.
But it certainly positioned us.
But there was a stay angry thing as well, wasn't there?
That's right. Fight Brexit, stay angry. Stay angry, fight Brexit. And I did feel that, and I do feel today that the biggest risk from my side, on my side clearly, is that we're making a huge mistake. And the biggest risk to us not being able to get out of that is complacency and boredom, and people just getting bored of it, which I think, and you probably agree with this, it would be tragic if that's how something happened, just because people had just got bored of it.
Well, I think my side's got bored with it.
Yeah, I think everyone's bored of it. I don't blame them,
Yeah.
So,
but you're still angry.
I still get. In fact, I'm more angry now when I see, after 2.5 years of absolute. So there's two levels of anger. One is I'm angry about the idea that we're leaving this union, which I think has been a really wholly positive thing. Not wholly, but a very positive thing for Britain. But I'm equally as angry at the absolute cack-handedness of this government and the way that they've handled the whole issue. And I'm pretty angry with the opposition as well for the way that they've fudged things and have been unclear. And I think have failed this concept of representative democracy, which we depend on. We don't live in a delegatory democracy. We live it where people are meant to look after our best interests. And even if you think, democracy should be respected and that was the vote and we should see it through because all of those people will feel terribly disenfranchised, and I agree with that, apart from the see it through bit. Even if you think that, the lack of directness and clarity and honesty to the electors, that's what I think is the great betrayal, that no one's been straight with people right up until the moment when you couldn't avoid it.
Can I ask you about your position on this? Because the Hemingway stuff was very illustrative for me, and the sort of romanticism about Europe, which I understand. Yeah. So if it had been the other way around, what I mean is, if staying in Europe had cost us a bit, if there'd have been an economic hit for staying in, say Europe had collapsed in some particular way and so forth, I'm presuming that you would still be a stayer in, irrespective of whether it would be.
It depends how much. It depends how much. But and I think that I can see exactly the positioning of the question. It's absolutely right. I can see how to me it was never about the economy.
Yeah, me neither.
It was about, and I've written pieces about this, it wasn't about, regulating economic regulations or the curvature of bananas, it was about regulating our propensity to kill each other. That to me was the most important thing.
The peace argument is the absolute.
And demonstrably, with a couple of notable exceptions, demonstrably Europe has succeeded in that. And now, I think the mistake that people make is to think that peace is just a consequence of progress and civilization, and that it's inconceivable that Europe would again fall into warring factions. And I don't think it's inconceivable. I think that you see the rise of people on either end of the political spectrum, and you see tension and conflict that could easily, I think, develop into something much more serious.
Do you think nationalism or patriotism or however, do you have a patriotic side?
I don't think it's like saying, do you think your good or evil. I don't think anyone would say no, I'm not patriotic. But however,
I think people might. I mean,
really?
people might say, I think patriotism is a very dangerous thing, and I sort of like, I'm proud a bit of my country, but I'm like, I'm aware that's been a dangerous thing.
Yes. Well, so I think the patriotism I would brand myself with would be one that said that I recognise that Britain is a intrinsic part of this great community of nations and has played an absolute leading role, and I'm so proud of that. And of course, like, looking back to as we were talking earlier, people like my grandfather who sacrificed so much to help beat the evil out of Europe. Immensely proud of that, of course. But this idea that a geography is somehow special and distinct just because it's that seems to me, illogical and dangerous. And I also think it's vastly overestimated our influence in the world. And in many ways, you could look back at the collapse of empire and see Brexit as perhaps, the last washing through of the arrogance of Great Britain in terms of our global standing.
Don't you think there's a sort of don't you think there's also, maybe you just completely disagree with this, but I'm often accused of being a little Englander. One of the things I think about, and in a sense they're right, I am a little Englander, and what I mean by that is, like, we're no longer an empire, we're no longer this great sort of thing. We ought to have a little bit more modesty about our role in the world.
Totally.
And that modesty is that actually we are smaller than we often think we are.
Yeah.
And actually that fed into my decision rather than,
Well, I mean, I would agree with you completely. We've just reached different conclusions. So my conclusion was that we were much better off being a big seat at the table of the biggest trading bloc in the world, of an incredibly diverse set of cultures and influences, and rather than being this smaller thing on the side of all of that. That's what, in the economic side of things, really concerns me.
Well, one of the this is almost never talked about when it comes to Brexit, but one of the things for me that there's a sort of thing there's a sort of backstory that goes on. These things that drive you, but you never talk about.
Yeah,
is that part of my family is Jewish. My wife is Israeli.
Yeah,
and there's different responses to the catastrophe of the Second World War. In one sense, the European Union is a response to the catastrophe of the Second World War. You talked about it in terms of peace and bringing peace, and that response is that sort of nationalism was the problem, and you need to somehow, you need to share the sovereignty in all the way in which the. My wife's family went to Israel, and if you talk about this in Israel, you go to Israel and you talk about this, their nationalism isn't the problem. That the nation state was actually the lifeboat.
Yes.
That for many Jews, the nation state was the lifeboat, which was the absolute response to the horrors of the Second World War. So there's a way of, and there's all sorts of problems with Israel. But nonetheless, there's a sort of model of the nation state, which is as a sort of as a lifeboat,
as a safe place, a haven,
as a safe space where and I have a sense of that and a suspicion of, and this is where we differ, but a suspicion of transnational bodies where, and for me it's sovereignty, as and we can argue this, but where the sort of gap between people and power just gets too overextended, and then there's an alienation in that, which I think is highly problematic. And, that's what I felt when I've been in the Midlands and places like that.
Totally, I get it completely. And I, for my part, the European Union setup is deeply, deeply flawed, and the idea that we do have effectively an unelected kind of junta at the top of Europe with so much influence.
I'm so glad to hear you say that.
I think it's terrible. But that, to me, that doesn't negate the value of the collective. And so I'm very much in the idea that, it's almost doubly bad. If Jeremy Corbyn, for instance, really wants to transform this nation and stay true to the sense of internationalism that I think's at the heart of Labour, the last thing he should be doing is withdrawing from the place where he could have much magnified influence. That's my take on it.
He's an old style lefty like Ben and all of those sorts of things, which had an influence on me, which sees the European Union as a sort of like, a businessman's club. I guess that's part of his I mean, maybe you made the argument from your side. I think it is that sort of talk is all very 1970s. Capitalism has won the day. Just get over it and so forth. Maybe some of us can't.
Well, I mean, I don't. I think people get hung up on definitions of things. People talk about socialism and they talk about capitalism and they talk about Europeanism and they talk about all sorts of conservatism. And I'm a pragmatist, I would say, and that's where. So the biggest label of scorn these days is to call someone a centrist, and I am a centrist. Absolutely unashamedly feel that I like the economic freedoms of capitalism, but I am deeply wedded to the social good of socialism. And I don't think that there's necessarily a contradiction, except for the way that we're taught to think about politics, and you have to be in one camp or another. So that's what, and I also hate, and we are on a website called Unheard, which was explicitly about not getting away from group thought, and I think much of politics and much of society and most people are quite comfortable with thinking the way they're told to think, and that if I have one core value in my whole life that I hope I live up to, it's that it's never to take anything at face value and always to challenge the received wisdoms, and to kick back against them occasionally. The received wisdom that it was madness to launch a newspaper, bollocks to that.
So we haven't got a massive amounts of time. We've got tons of questions I want to ask you.
Sure.
I'm still rather taken with David Goodhart's distinction between anywheres and somewheres. Now, this is a distinction I imagine that you might not have that much truck with. So, one of the ways of analysing what went on a couple of years ago was this was a sort of, those people who don't have a particular loyalty to place. They sort of they're happy on aeroplanes and in international hotels and they go around the world and so forth. And those people who are rooted in the specifics of place and the loyalties of place that's not how you see
Not
this.
Not at all, no. And in fact, I feel when I was in Liverpool, on the Liverpool Echo, we used to joke about Scousers in London, bleeding hearts about going on about how great Liverpool was, and the best place in the world, and would never come back. And now I'm one of those people, but I still feel deeply wedded to what I see as the place of Liverpool, and the body of people. I feel emotionally connected to that. But I don't see the contradiction in exporting that in geographically. That's me. That's not the place. That's who I am. And in the same way, I don't necessarily agree with that premise, because then you look at places like the northeast of England, for instance, very largely voting to leave in almost diametrically opposite to the northwest, and I don't think that's about the place. I think that's attitudinal, that's experience based. That was their experience and a different take on their experience. So the geographical element of it confounds me a bit.
If we have a second referendum and you guys win, what is the remain answer?
Yeah.
And there may not be one, but what is the remain answer to the sort of anger and left behindness of Sunderland and other places?
I think it's a domestic challenge, and this is my point. I honestly believe, and this will be perceived as condescending, but it's not meant as such. I honestly believe you could have put a vote of anything in front of people that year and they would have voted against it, just to demonstrate that they were truly pissed off with the way that the government had let them down over the last 8 years, and the lack of infrastructure support and the huge classrooms and the queues at GPs and the state of the roads and everything, and in places the influx of what they saw as a threatening immigration that would challenge wages and also would change the way that their communities felt. I get all of that completely, but I think it's a massive failure of domestic politics. So I'm trapped in this paradox now where I accept completely we have politically squandered 2.5 years of the most desperately needed repair time to fix some of these really fundamental problems, and we've squandered it arguing about this bloody thing, Brexit. But to get back to the important things, I feel it's really necessary for us to get out of this thing which will further damage us and put us into another austerity phase, which we cannot afford. I think we're coming out of austerity.
We've got worse, haven't we, than we are? This time. We're more divided, more bitter.
Totally. Yeah, totally.
It's very nasty.
It's
isn't
tragic because, I can't. We both probably get a lot of stick from people who feel vehemently that we are wrong. I get called, treacherous a lot and a lot worse. But I understand why people say that, but there's no pretty end to this situation. There's no scenario, whatever happens, whoever wins, there's no scenario where a huge number of people don't feel very angry about what's happened.
That's right.
And when people talk about civil disturbance and stuff like this, I think they're absolutely right to. But I think my guess is that if and when there is some civil disturbance, it will be a fury directed towards the leadership of this nation, not towards the leadership of the European Union. The absolute negligence and incompetence that this Parliament, and I'll cover both the government and the oppositions, have shown, and a real abrogation of their duty, I think, to tell us the truth. And people will see it for what it has been 2 years of political gamesmanship that is going to cost people's livelihoods.
And I don't know how people like you and I do this. But, whatever happens, and neither of us know how this is going to turn out. Neither of us know who's going to win, quote unquote. But it looks very binary. It does look like winning. Yeah. People of goodwill really have a responsibility to find a way of talking to each other past whatever happens and so forth. And like we've sat here, we've had a very civil conversation. We're not like, these sorts of conversations are actually quite rare, aren't they? Across a divide, because we're always point scoring on the telly or in the newspapers and so forth like that. Have you got any ideas how we bind up ourselves?
I think people should spend, and I include myself in this, a lot less time on Twitter and social media. I really, you read back Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message, and he couldn't have been more on the money when it came to Twitter. And because it's not just about the contraction of thought, it's about all the characteristics of Twitter. They need to be there first to say something, to have a very strong opinion, to get lots of retweets and acceptance, and to be able to pretend that what is hugely sophisticated and complex can be expressed in a couple of sentences. And when I see politicians really taking the lead on Twitter, and then you see 9 months later those tweets becoming white papers, I feel this is really dangerous, and Twitter has fundamentally changed our society.
I completely agree with you. I took a month off Twitter and I got into trouble from that because obviously, and you know this, because Twitter is one of the most important ways for journalists
to market your journalism.
To market your journalism. So you can't come off Twitter and I can't come
off
Twitter.
My wife hates Twitter.
My wife hates it.
Hates it. And she thinks less of me because I'm on Twitter.
Same.
And so she has begged me in the past to come off it. And then, so I have done for bits at a time. But then GQ, for instance, where I write a column on politics, will come on and say, what the hell are you doing? Get back on Twitter. It's where the numbers are. And so, again, we are trapped in this. If you want to have a voice and you want to have an opinion, you want to engage, that's where there's a big community of people. So,
and how we managed to have civil conversations on Twitter once there are people coming in from all sides who are calling, for me, a racist or whatever it is and so forth like that. That's because it's very easy to be distracted by that and then get angry and react.
Yes, and I think, people. I can tell you a lot of people who have become depressed because of the response of people on Twitter. And my rule now is I never look at the replies. I look at verified replies. You can segregate things by people who are verified or not. But I'm afraid I don't engage in the conversation that a tweet might provoke anymore.
Yeah, no, I understand that.
Yeah.
Well, we have a responsibility. We'll see what happens, Matt. Have you got any guesses? If you went down to Ladbrokes this afternoon, what would you say?
I've said now for 2 years that it doesn't work. Right, Brexit doesn't work, and for a year now said the only logical way this ends up, given that it doesn't work and they're going to get nothing through Parliament, and given now that it's become clear, which is I think is great from my side, that no deal will not be allowed somehow. They'll find a way to stop no deal. I just can't see any alternative to passing it back to the people. And my view, and this is where we'll fundamentally disagree, is that that is the essence of democracy, is to say things have changed so much, you should be given the right to affirm.
If they say out again,
I'll stand by it.
You stand by that?
100%.
You stand
because
by it?
How can I argue people are now informed and can make a much more informed decision and then say the day after, well, bollocks to that, I still don't agree with them. Well, I won't agree with it, and I will always carry on arguing for the benefits of having a leading role within the continent of Europe. But I would swing by the Leave vote, and we would turn it into the new Brexiteer, and we would absolutely try and mate, I'm not going to miss a publishing opportunity like that.
you promised me
honestly,
that if we win, you'll have a newspaper headline that says the new Brexiteer.
We absolutely will. And
shake your hand on that.
Matt
Kelly, that's fantastic. We're going to end on that note.
Right.
A pleasure to talk to you,
You're
my
welcome.
friend. Pleasure.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Confessions with me, Giles Fraser. If you're enjoying the podcast, please do rate and review it, and do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'll be joined by another guest next week for another episode of Soul Bearing, and I do hope you'll tune in then. And do check out the website unheard.com.